Today on Pilgrim Radio's His People, Dinah Dye on God as warrior in the book of Exodus.
We see in the Exodus story, he totally routs the Egyptians, right? And he sends them, the waters return, he sends them to the deep, and Pharaoh and army and drown. So this whole water thing, which we actually have in the Exodus story. And he's the conqueror and the deliverer. And of course, he uses his representative Moses as his human representative.
Dinah Dye next. Coming up, Spencer Dalkey talks with Dinah Dye. She's a TV host, conference speaker, and a scholar of the Torah. Spencer will be asking her about her book, The Greatest Exodus, a divine warrior tradition.
By way of introduction, I understand you were raised in a Jewish home or Jewish community. I was curious how that upbringing shaped you and your understanding of Exodus.
Yeah, honestly, I think it's, shaped everything. So yeah, I grew up in Ottawa, Canada. We are in a Jewish, Orthodox, conservative Jewish community. I went to an Orthodox Jewish summer camp, attended synagogue with the family, but my parents moved out of the main part of town into what they called the West End, to where there were no Jews whatsoever. So my upbringing was really around a lot of quote unquote Gentiles, and I think they were all out to save me. I had never read the New Testament. I didn't know anything. When I was in school, and this is going way back, we had religion class. And so the teacher would say, Dinah, you can leave since you're Jewish, and this isn't appropriate for you. I'm 10 years old and totally embarrassed, don't want to get up in front of the whole class and draw all that attention to myself. So I just would sit and listen. So that's the first time I heard the Lord's Prayer, and I heard about someone called Jesus, and I just planted that in my head. But our family, we did our festivals. Passover was the sort of the highlight of the year, and then what we would have the high holidays in the fall, what we call Rosh Hashanah, or the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. So those were the most important times of the year, for our family and for our community. And I learned the liturgy. I learned how to read the Bible in Hebrew. So that all, those things really mattered once I became a Christian, which was many, many years later. So that's sort of the beginning stages of that. And, that I feel has really helped me balance both worlds. Once I did become a Christian many years later, I was in a church for, a number of years. And I think that balance has helped me bridge the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament, which is something not everyone understands. And I find sometimes Christians have sort of abandoned the Old Testament, thinking that it's irrelevant, but it's absolutely foundational to your faith. So that's sort of my testimony there in a nutshell.
I'm curious what prompted your writing about Exodus. What got you thinking about that?
So again, going back to Passover, because I literally have celebrated, I don't want to age myself, but I've celebrated over 70 Passovers. So every year, of course, we tell the story of the Exodus. And that's really in the DNA of the Jewish people. We just repeat that cycle every year. And so we, as a family, would get together, usually at my grandparents' house. They were from the old country, from Russia. And we would go through the entire 5 hours worth of Passover, half of it in Hebrew. A lot of it, I didn't know what was going on as a child. And then, of course, we would drink the 4 glasses of wine, which was great when you're 10 years old, right? And so that planted a seed for me. And I think most Jews, whether they know it or not, recognize that as the most significant, groundbreaking, most important event that happened in the life of the Jewish people, between them and God. So that seed was planted quite early. It took a very long time to take root until I finally got around to writing this book.
Just looking at, I guess, some of your ideas that you were thinking about, you describe it as a divine warrior tradition.
Yeah.
Would you tell us why you use that particular phrase to describe Exodus?
So it is one of the phrases that apply to God Yahweh. He calls himself a divine warrior. See that through the book of Psalms and in various places. And even when you read the actual Exodus event, when they're at the sea and what he does, he functions in that role as a divine warrior. The problem is this is completely foreign to, Christian audiences. Nobody even thinks about God in that role. But it is something, especially if you're reading the Psalms, that will come out. And I also spend quite a bit of time studying, analyzing, exploring the ancient Near East world, because that is the world in which the Bible was written. Unfortunately, we don't know that. And so we want to approach the Bible strictly from a modern understanding. Well, we're like 3,000 years from that. So I've really tried to dive into how the ancient world functioned and how the Bible fits into that ancient world. And what I discovered was that world was they have something called combat myth. And everything they did in that world, which of course is filled with all the gods and the goddesses and all that weird stuff, but they were always fighting. There was always wars and violence and bloodshed. Everything to gain control over another was very violent, and this is conquest. And so I compare that to with how did God create? Because their creation stories, the ancient Near East world creation stories, were always combat stories. One God defeating another, again in bloody conquest. But then when we see the creation story in Genesis, it was 180 degrees revolutionary for that time, because what did God do? He spoke. He spoke by the word and by the spirit, and creation came into being. We can't even appreciate how foreign that would have been to an ancient culture. It would have stood out quite a bit. So I was trying to present folks with understanding that's how that world functioned. And so how does that work for us? And I wanted to continue to show the differences. My point isn't to say that sort of the Bible and Israel and replayed the ancient world, but how did they stand out? How did God elevate their world so it was so different from the ancient world that these ancient cultures and nations or whatever would look at Israel and go, whoa, that's not how it's supposed to work. So this combat myth, this divine warrior thing is everywhere all through the Bible. If you think about it, Israel was, constantly doing battle, with the nations around them, led by Yahweh, and they find themselves under the boot of empire their entire existence practically. You will be hard pressed to find very much time where Israel is an independent sovereign state, right? They just continually go under the foot of another empire. And so this theme is just constant. How does God deliver his people? And he doesn't, even though he's called divine warrior, he doesn't use the same methods. But we see in the Exodus story, he totally routs the Egyptians, right? And he sends them, the waters return, he sends them to the deep, and Pharaoh and army and drown. So this whole water thing, which we actually have in the Exodus story. And he's the conqueror and the deliverer. And of course, he uses his representative Moses as his human representative to lead the children of Israel through the wilderness. And so there's just that whole confrontation, that whole battle at the sea is really him expressing himself as a divine warrior. So that I kind of set the stage for that. It's a different angle on the Exodus story, and not one people are at all familiar with. But once we get into the New Testament, we see Jesus doing the exact same thing. Like he is a conqueror and a deliverer and a warrior, especially in the book of Revelation, right? And he conquers the sea and he walks on the sea and he overcomes the seas and he delivers from demons. So these are all warrior type actions. So he really fulfills that role in the New Testament. This is a very big topic. I'm kind of throwing out a lot here, but just to get to your viewers to see that imagery is all through the scriptures, right on from Genesis through to Revelation.
I understand. I noticed you wrote a little bit about, even the idea of chaos, and how, you even mentioned there like pagan myths of bringing order out of chaos from, conquest, combat. it's not an idea I guess we think about a lot as Christians, as Messianic Jews. So I'm curious, like, what importance, if any, is the idea of chaos to to the Christian, and how does that impact, I guess, one's faith?
Well, honestly, if they just turn on their TV for 5 minutes, they pretty much get chaos, right? I mean, there's really only two positions. You're either in a state of order or you're in a state of chaos. So that balance between those two things was very, again, looking in the ancient Near East world, they saw everything in that realm, either in order and chaos. So what I want folks to see is how God restores order out of chaos all through the Bible, and starting in Genesis, really, when it talks about the world is empty and void and without form, technically a state of chaos. And that state of chaos was translated as the seas. So the seas in the ancient world became symbolic for chaos because they have no form and no structure. You can't build on a sea, right? And so the seas morphed into armies, etc. And so the ancient Hebrews were terrified of the seas. They were not seafaring people, so that was not comfort zone for them. So chaos, it sort of grew out of just initially the state of disorder, and then into the idea of what the seas would be. So, for example, the women in the Bible, the matriarchs, Rachel and Sarah, etc., who were all barren, the ancients would consider that a state of chaos because they couldn't bring forth life, right? No seed, no fruit, no life would come forth. So that was a state of chaos. Exile, when Israel is sent into exile, that was considered a state of chaos because they have been removed from their land, from their God, from their king, from their, their structure. They lose their identity, their language, etc. That's a state of chaos. When they're sent into the wilderness was seen as a state of chaos. So in a place of chaos, life does not come forth. And so God is constantly transforming these environments so that new life can come forth. So new life from the barren women, new life out of the wilderness, removing them from the wilderness, removing them from exile, and restoring them back to the land where his presence would dwell among them. So there are many examples in the Bible of sort of a chaos state. And then we can see how God brings order out of that state. Military armies coming in, destroying everything in sight, killing everyone, all that. Clearly a state of chaos. And so the desire of the ancient people, which is the same desire for us today, is to have leadership that is benevolent and beneficent and rules and reigns over us to restore order and to bring life. And so the ultimate King of Kings here is going to be Jesus, right? Who is the great restorer of life and the great restorer of order.
Yeah, I love, I just love the idea of, you wrote about the ancient Hebrew writers adopting some of the storytelling techniques of the pagan mythologists, but of course made it different in that, God creates simply by the word of his power. Right. Jesus can say, quiet, and the seas are just calm. I've also heard that, I guess, to this point of God's just, there's no resisting God. Like, there's no combat with God. Like, he just wins.
Right.
I have heard that the 10 plagues in the Exodus story was a direct attack and God showing his power over even Egypt's gods. Do you write about that at all? And can you tell us about that?
I did write about that in the book, and that's exactly right. So we don't look at, that's your perfect example of a combat myth. And of course, in the ancient time in Egypt, the pharaoh was considered as a god. So you essentially have two gods. Now, the role of the king and the pharaoh, or whatever culture you're talking about, was to bring order to his empire. And his subjects would worship him and show allegiance to him because he made everything good. everything. They're well provided for. They're not having to have battles with enemies. They could just live in comfort and peace because the ruler that was in power was a good guy and he was going to, restore order from them. Well, so everything's going along swimmingly in Egypt, right? And then there's this people group that Egypt enslaves to, be the chief builders of everything. And folks probably love that, and they can just kick back and float down the Nile or whatever. And then along comes this God, Yahweh, and he totally routs Egypt, the Pharaoh, and the gods of Egypt. And in fact, each plague is said to represent a different particular god in Egypt. So, in the eyes of the Egyptian people, imagine there's their king Pharaoh god, whom they worship, but this other god comes along and totally humiliates the Pharaoh in front of the people, and he can no longer provide security and comfort for the people. And this god upends everything, and every basic part of their lives is completely upended and destroyed. So it's really the plagues are really a battle of the gods. And God, of course, he uses nature or natural things to upend the entirety of the life of the Egyptians. So you can imagine by the end, the Pharaoh's like, okay, I've had enough of this humiliation. Off you go worship out in the wilderness. So yes, you're exactly right on that.
While we're on the subject of order, I'm just kind of curious how Exodus, from what you've been studying, can instruct us today, especially when it seems like order is kind of a bad word and it feels dirty and oppressive. How can Exodus instruct us in God's order?
Yeah, I think so. In my opinion, and after writing the book, is that the story of the Exodus and how it unfolds is really the template, and Israel is really walking out that story. And you could argue that even today, I mean, we're still in exile, right? We're still wandering around the wilderness, it seems. So even when Judah went back to the land after the exile and they were in the land, and they had a period there where they were sovereign until, of course, the Romans came along and they were now under the thumb of the Romans. This seems to be sort of the natural state of the world. It's like we live under under the thumb of an empire, and we are wandering around the wilderness, living in a sort of a chaotic state. And so out of that, what does God do? He takes them on a journey through an exile, chaotic place, and he brings them to a mountain. And what's significant about mountains in the ancient world is that they were considered to be the first fixed point that came out of water, out of chaos. They were considered a place of stability and permanence. And so anytime you see mountains in scripture, of which there are many, lights should go off, because this is some sort of dramatic experience is going to happen, because the point of a mountain was to be that bridge between heaven and earth. So typically in the ancient world, you had temples were always built on top of mountains, because that's the place where heaven and earth came together. And so God leads the children of Israel to this mountain where he's going to make a covenant with them, and he will be declared their king, and he will be restoring heaven and earth, if you will. And so I think that's the whole goal of our life, is the restoration of the relationship, the covenant relationship between us and God, between us and Yahweh. And of course, we're not doing it on a mountain per se, but he offers that covenant relationship, and with it, the protection and provision that he gives. And so his goal is to return. I think it really is the story of the Bible completely, from Genesis to Revelation, is that God's desire is for his presence to dwell among his people again. Because wherever there is sin and corruption and violation, his presence does not dwell there. So the goal with the covenant, the restoring of the covenant relationship, is for his presence to dwell in the midst of his people. So I think that is sort of in the final analysis what he is doing in the Exodus story. Certainly at the mountain, now we know they wander around for 40 years in the wilderness, but they finally do eventually cross over the Jordan into the land. And another 300 and some years go by, but eventually Solomon builds the temple, and it's going to house the presence of God. It's a long story, but that's the goal of God, is for his presence to be in the midst of his people. And so I would say today, that goal is for God to be in the midst of the presence of his people scattered all over the world. We are one community. We are unified in that, and that we are a living, breathing temple, if you will, on the move throughout the earth. And God's desire is to be in our midst in a covenant relationship. So the goal again is restoring, renewing the covenant between us and God. And we do that, of course, through Jesus. He is the mediator of the covenant.
There are so many details that you've mentioned in Exodus, like the mountain, the plagues, these sorts of things. Are there other details that perhaps we overlook if we get familiar with the story that are nevertheless important to the theme of Exodus?
There's a myriad. I mean, honestly, there's another couple of programs to unpack all that. I would really encourage people to read the book. Right, the Greatest Exodus it's on Amazon, so you can. It's easy to find. Again, it goes back to appreciating the ancient culture, and it's not a culture like ours, and they lived in a world in which the supernatural and the natural overlapped. We divide them into separate sections. So we got the natural world on Monday through Saturday, or depending if you worship on Saturday, and then Sunday or Shabbat, somehow the supernatural enters in, right? We get together and we pray and great things happen. But the rest of the week, we just go to work and pack lunch for the kids. That was not their world. Those two things operated together. And that is very difficult for us to understand. I find it hard to really appreciate that, because I'm like looking out at the natural world. And so all of these things, these elements like rivers and seas and mountains and temples and, creation, trees. I mean, we could go on. Gardens are like ground zero in the Bible, right? But they're ground zero in the ancient world, because when a king came to the throne, one of the first things he did to prove his power was to build a garden. And if he went to conquest against another king, he would go and take the saplings and cuttings out of that king's garden and bring them back and plant them into his own garden. So this was a declaration of power through these gardens. So gardens, we see right out of the gate the importance of gardens. And of course, the promised land was going to be considered as a garden. And you think about, for instance, Jesus, after he was resurrected, the Marys, they identify him as a gardener, right? But that was a confirmation that the king had been risen from the dead, because a gardener was another title for a king. He was called a gardener or a horticulturalist. So all these we just brush by this. We just read it. We don't even think about it. But there's something profound going on. And so as he is resurrected from the dead, he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and they see him in a garden. And while the writer does not tell us these things, these are things that we have to learn to understand by identifying this in the ancient world. So also mountains, going back to that, I did not realize this. I read a guy's dissertation on the mountains in the book of Matthew. And he thought there were 6 mountains. I actually could see 7 mountains in there, which was interesting. Some think there's 8, but that's another story. But the structure of Matthew, which is really the story of Moses through Jesus being replayed, all takes place on mountains. There are 7 mountains in the book of Matthew where all the major events take place. From the very first mountain, we see Yeshua doing battle with the adversary, the Hasatan, the devil, whatever you want to call him. We see the Sermon on the Mount. We see the Transfiguration on the mountain. We see the feeding of the 5,000 on a mountain. We see the feeding of the 4,000 on the mountain. And then the final, go ye into all the world, the Great Commission, is on a mountain. Like, that's not an accident. Now, Luke, none of the other gospel writers, they're on the plains. They don't even, so there's a backstory here. And you can actually see in the Exodus story that Moses ascended the mountain 7 times. I thought, this is not an accident. The gospel writers know this. And they're not telling us directly because they don't ever seem to do that, right? They infer things, they expect you to know stuff, and then they're giving you an interpretation like you're going, holy cow. So, yes, Moses has this whole experience of the seven access to the divine presence on the mountain. And then we see the same thing happen in the book of Matthew. Like, that's just a small sampling, but it's all over the place. And again, this goes back to Christians not knowing the Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures. If they knew the Exodus story better, they could see how Yeshua, Jesus, is functioning in the role of Moses and in the role of Israel and working out the entire salvation plan that was in, that the Exodus story tells. He's just replaying it, only to a greater degree, obviously.
Or I was thinking about asking about Moses, but it seems like, yeah, he's just God setting himself up to be a type, I guess, of Christ. Yeah. Wow.
And so if you don't know anything about him, or you don't really know what he's doing, or, you don't pay any attention to it, or you don't think about that whole grand event at Mount Sinai, which is just a tremendous story there, you're going to miss. And it just sort of grieves my heart when I hear Christians just say, well, the Old Testament has been done with and it's no longer relevant. You are missing everything. And honestly, I don't think that you can really understand Jesus' story without understanding Israel's story, because he is replaying Israel's story. So the more you know about Israel's story, the more you're going to understand what Jesus is doing. And then ultimately, they're one and the same. And then ultimately, he's taking it to the greatest degree, in which, with his resurrection. Obviously, they weren't resurrected, but that to me is really important, and it's really what I'm trying to communicate to Christians who are not familiar with it, or have no desire, or don't think it's important, just how important it really is.
Well, I guess as we're getting close to the end of my time, I'll just put this one last question to you. You mentioned at the beginning and all throughout this conversation just the way Christians maybe don't take the Old Testament seriously, and some of the ways that can maybe shoot our faith in the foot. We like, don't we, to think of God as the gracious God he is. Obviously, it's important that he's gracious. If he were not gracious, it would be hellfire for every one of us.
Right.
But is there comfort, too, in the fact that, as you've written, God is a divine warrior? And how has maybe that changed your life?
I'm a big proponent of defeating the enemy, however the enemy looks. I don't know about you, but I like the movies I watch where, there's the character comes on and just beats them all up, or does whatever has to be done to take out that force. And so much, there's so much in the Bible really about God defeating the enemy, like over and over and over again. Even when Israel was just disobedient, rebellious, he continually defeats the enemy. And that enemy obviously can take multiple forms. So again, for the ancients, that enemy came in the form of chaos. But you see a picture of, we call the serpent in the garden is a figure, which in Hebrew is Hasatan, which means the adversary. So anytime you have some kind of adversary coming after you, of course, we see that perfect example in Matthew of Jesus and the adversary, right, going at. And the adversary is really the counterfeit of what Jesus will be doing. So you can find myriads of enemies in your own life, right? Lots of times it's yourself. Like within your own self, you are dealing with all kinds of character traits that, you really wish you didn't have. I see all those as sort of little enemies that keep coming after me. So the divine warrior is more than capable of defeating whatever enemy confronts you. So for me, my testimony is quite wild, because I spent 5 years living out of a backpack in Europe back in the 70s, experiencing a lot of sort of physical things like wars and rumors of wars and military coups and things of that nature. But even before I became a believer and in Jesus, I had a relationship with God always. And so I saw his hand, even in those years of my own rebellion as, 70s hippie, always, it's like he was always parting the seas whenever I got to a place where I couldn't deal with whatever, or just how challenging and burdensome things were coming at me. He always provided a way through. Now, not necessarily the way I wanted, but always provided a way through. And so mine has been a 45, almost 50 years walk, with God and with Yeshua. And the hand of God in my life, and seeing how, Jesus has moved in mighty ways. Like I said, not the way I expected. I feel it would be hard pressed to shatter my faith. I mean, it could happen, right? But I have walked a very long time with him, and I'm trying to understand the scriptures in this way, and trying to see his actions and how they operate in my own life. And then I see it, really just in the lives of my family and the community and the world in general. So it's been a long journey, but that concept of divine warrior defeating the enemies in my own life is very real to me.
You've been listening to His People on Pilgrim Radio. Many thanks to our guest, Dinah Dye, TV host, conference speaker, scholar of the Torah, and author of The Greatest Exodus, a divine warrior tradition. Tomorrow on His People, our guest is Rebecca Corwin, talking about God's revelation through food.
And so I went from Genesis to Revelation and pulled out every scripture that I could related to food. And as I started compiling them, I realized that God was less interested in using food to tell us what to eat than he was in telling us who he is.
That's tomorrow at the same time, right here on His People. Thanks for listening.